you stand as I read from Luke chapter 21? I'm going to read verses 25 through 36. There will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and on the earth distress among nations, confused by the roaring of the sea and the waves. People will faint from fear and foreboding of what is coming upon the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now when these things begin to take place, stand up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Then he told them a parable. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. As soon as they sprout leaves, you can see for yourselves and know that summer is already near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that the kingdom of God is near. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Be on guard so that your hearts are not weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of this life, and that day does not catch you unexpectedly like a trap. For it will come upon all who live on the face of the whole earth. Be alert at all times, praying that you may have the strength to escape all these things that will take place and to stand before the Son of Man. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the world.
Thanks be to God.
Amen. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Well, church, Happy New Year. As we head into this holy season that we call Advent, we do so on the tail of the quintessential American holiday, right? That holiday is, of course, let's say it together, Black Friday. Y'all didn't say it with me. Oh, you thought I was going to say Thanksgiving, didn't you? Well, that makes sense. But how did you celebrate either Black Friday or Thanksgiving? Did you overdo it a little bit? Y'all didn't eat too much? If you didn't, you weren't celebrating right. I'll say that. Did anybody actually go shopping on Black Friday? Did you just shop too much? Were you guys exhausted after Thanksgiving and need a nap? There's a Greek word for the overeating that we do on Thanksgiving. There's a word for the overspending that happens on Black Friday, and that Greek word is kryopale. It's not a common word in the New Testament. It's not common at all, actually. The only time it shows up in all of the New Testament is in Luke chapter 21, verse 34, which I just read. It's this word, do not be weighed down with kryopale, or dissipation. I don't know about you, but I had to look up what the word dissipation really means. You ever have that experience when you're reading something and you can pronounce the word and the context kind of gives you a clue, and then you're like, hold on a second. What is that word? I had to look up dissipation. It's if you want to have some fun, you can go to the King James Version. It's called surfeiting, which isn't really any help. So I looked it up, and it means to make yourself sick from overeating and overdrinking. It is this indulgence. When I worked at a barbecue restaurant, I saw people dissipate all the time. We called it the meat sweats. Kayla and I ate at that restaurant. It's called Jack Stack Barbecue over Thanksgiving when we were in Kansas City with Kayla's family for the holidays. And we ate at Jack Stack Barbecue, and thankfully, none of us got the meat sweats. No dissipation for us that time. But on Thanksgiving, we eat a lot of turkey with tryptophan. We eat potatoes and breads with a lot of starch. And we go for a long stretch between breakfast and dinner. And all of these things contribute to that Thanksgiving fatigue where you're just worn out. And I know maybe Thanksgiving isn't the best example because this of all days is the day that you're supposed to feast. You're supposed to kind of overdo it on Thanksgiving, but because feasting is a good and beautiful thing, dissipation would be less like a once in a blue moon feasting for a holiday and more like treating every single day as Thanksgiving. What if you ate like that all the time? What if we treated every day as if it was like that, overeating and overdrinking on a regular basis? But the thing about dissipation is it's not only the overindulgence of eating, no, it's also the squandering of money, energy, and resources, like Black Friday. We as a culture are pretty good at dissipation, aren't we? I heard. Actually, it was just this weekend. I heard a commentator, a political commentator, say something to the effect of, Americans aren't good at reacting, we're good at overreacting. We kind of overdo it a little bit. Dissipation. And today we start our Advent series on this first Sunday of the new year. It's a new year for the church, and we focus now on Advent. Do you know what Advent means? Quite simply, Advent means arrival. The word Advent just means arrival. The church year starts with Advent, which isn't merely a remembrance of the birth of Christ. Advent is not primarily about the birth of Jesus. That's Christmas. Advent is before that. Advent is anticipation. Advent is looking forward. We are anticipating the arrival of Christ. So Advent is actually less about the birth of Jesus and more about the second coming of Jesus. Advent is about his arrival to us, which is why we read apocalyptic texts this morning, like Luke 21 and Jeremiah 33. Now, apocalypse simply means revelation. In our broader culture, when we hear the word apocalypse, I don't know what you think of, but we think of doom and destruction and Ben Affleck. I don't know. Apocalypse just means revelation, the revealing of something. And so Advent is a season where we are looking for the revealing of Jesus in our world. So Advent is when we look forward. Advent is about what will be. Now there's an Episcopalian priest, author, and poet named Fleming Rutledge, and she wrote, Advent begins in the dark. And I'm inclined to believe that she is right. As we look to our passages for this first Sunday of Advent, we see the darkness. Did you catch it as we were listening to Jeremiah 33 and as you were listening to Luke 21? Now, I'm going to make an elder millennial reference here in just a moment. You know what an elder millennial is? My generation are these kind of elder millennials. When I was a kid, here's a reference that might be specific to a few people. There was a TV show called Are You Afraid of the Dark? I was not allowed to watch Are You Afraid of the Dark when I was a kid because my parents believed it was too scary for me. And to their credit, it would have been. I don't do well with scary things. At least I didn't. But it's a good question for us. Are you afraid of the dark? As you look at your life, where is there darkness? As you look back on those dark moments of your life that you've experienced, how did you fare? How do you cope with the darkest moments of your life? It's kind of a weird thing to begin in the dark in this season where we celebrate the arrival of the light. But Advent is a season of anticipation. It begins in the dark. But what's really strange is that on the first Sunday of Advent, we lit the candle of hope. We heard Marisol's testimony just a moment ago about what hope means to her and her lived experience. How is it that this Sunday's emphasis is an emphasis of hope, yet our texts today are so dark and heavy? Did you catch what we read in Jeremiah 33? Did you catch what we read in Luke 21? There will be signs in the sun and moon and stars. People will faint from fear and foreboding of what is coming upon the world. That's something we can say thanks be to God about, right? How is it that we emphasize hope today, yet our texts were kind of heavy and apocalyptic? In Jeremiah 33, we read this earlier. At the time of Jeremiah's writing, it's really fascinating. You look at what's happening at the time of Jeremiah's writing, Jeremiah 33. The Israelite people, do you know what's happened to Israel? The people are divided. The nation of Israel has been split, and it's on the verge of collapse. There were two kingdoms, Israel in the south and Judah in the north. And if you keep reading in Jeremiah, in just a few chapters, we'll read about King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon overtaking Jerusalem. Jeremiah 33, this text is in the middle of dark days for the Israelite people. And the prophet Jeremiah knows that. It's in the midst of this darkness that Jeremiah proclaims, in those days and at that time I will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David, and he shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In those days Judah will be saved and Jerusalem will live in safety. In the midst of a divided people, God promises not two branches, but one. Listen, the people are split. The people are separate. The people live in two different camps and don't see eye to eye. I don't know if you've ever lived in the midst of a culture where people are separated in one camp or another. Maybe not by north or south, maybe by red and blue. In the midst of a divided people, God promises through his prophet one branch, not two. This emphasizes unity, not disunity. Out of their present darkness, God will show up and bring the people together. Then in Luke, as I read just a moment ago, we see the arrival of God in the midst of darkness. There will be signs and the lights, the sun, the moon, and stars. The seas will rage, chaos will abound. I don't know about you, but you all want to pack up and go there? You want to go to those dark days? Because the gospel writer Luke is describing dark days, and yet he writes, now when these things begin to take place, stand up and raise your heads, because the day of redemption is drawing near. I don't know, guys. How do we respond when darkness befalls us? When it feels like the heavens are just against us. Raise up your heads. Your redemption is drawing near. I mean, it's not how things work, right? Well, here's the thing. Advent begins in the dark. In the dark, God shows up. And then in the parable of the fig tree, in this story, Jesus recognizes that it is out of the winter that life springs forth. He's recognizing that after winter, you look at the trees and you can see them blossoming and fruiting. Jesus says that after the season of darkness and death, the season we are just now embarking upon, you can see the signs of life upon the tree. In the dark, God shows up. This just seems to be the great narrative arc of God's redemption. We see it in the readings for today, but we also see it in God's story. First, it was in that God created all things. The earth was formless and void, and what covered the face of the deep in Genesis? Darkness covered the face of the deep. And then God spoke, and what was? Light. In the dark, God created all things in the dark. Which is why, for the Hebrew people, the new day doesn't start at dawn. Maybe you know this, but for Jewish people, the new day does not start in the morning or at midnight. The new day starts at dusk, at sundown. When the sun sets, a new day begins. Each new day begins in the dark. The pattern of Jewish lives speaks a theological truth. The day starts in the dark, and out of the dark, the light breaks. And this reminds them of God's redemption in the dark. And then when God looked at this world and saw that it was broken, how did God respond? When God wanted to make all things new, did he blow up the earth and start over? Did God run away from the darkness and the death and the sin of our lives? When God looked and saw this, these things are not as they ought to be. When God saw the brokenness and sin and chaos that humanity had brought upon his good creation, God did not respond in anger or retreat or with silence. You know, those are the three responses, right? Fight, flight, or freeze. Although they're also talking about another one, fawn, which I don't know if that's much different than freeze. But when God perceived the darkness of our hearts, God did not run away. No, instead, God entered into that darkness. God became a part of the darkness of this world through the incarnation of his Son, Jesus Christ. He did not run away from it. He arrived in the dark. And that's good news. God did not abandon or destroy. No, instead, God sought to redeem us from the darkness by sharing in it with us. I mean, the story of God's redemption takes place in the darkness. It might not stay there, but it seems as though that's where it is birthed. Well, and if that's God's response to darkness, what does that mean about how we respond to the darkness of our own lives and circumstances and situations? Back to a question I asked you just a few moments ago. Are you afraid of the dark? Are you afraid of that darkness? How do you respond when you find yourself in darkness? That question assumes you've experienced darkness in your life. Have you ever had those moments where it feels like the shadow is creeping in closer and closer? What did that darkness look like? Maybe an unexpected and untimely death. Maybe a timely death. Maybe that darkness looked like divorce. Maybe it looked like betrayal from someone who was supposed to love you well and didn't. Maybe that darkness was job loss and financial insecurity. Maybe that darkness was a really challenging diagnosis that you weren't expecting or that you had hoped would come out differently. Maybe that darkness is job loss and home loss. I don't know, look at the world around us, church. Wars and rumors of wars, right? Ukraine right now is struggling to push back the invasion of their imperialist neighbor. The Middle East is heating up. Just in the last week, Syria is a mess again. And Georgia, the country, not the state. I need to make sure that I qualify. Georgia, the state, might be a mess too. I don't know. I don't go down south very much. But Georgia, the country, is in the midst of a potential revolution. I don't bring any of these things up to trigger any hard feelings or difficulty, but to recognize that we all experience darkness in our lives. We all experience dark days to one degree or another. We've all been there. And in a lot of ways, our world is there right now. So how do we respond? Are you afraid of the dark? Well, I think Jesus knew how we were inclined to respond. And Luke records that for us today. It is this word that we mentioned at the start, dissipation. Or maybe a more contemporary description would be, we numb. We numb. Right? When faced with the darkness of our lives or of our world, we numb. Often. Maybe it's not like Jesus said with alcohol, with drunkenness, or maybe it is. For many, booze is a way to not feel the hurt, to avoid that thing, whatever that thing is, even just for a night. It's been a real hard season. I deserve this. Let me just escape for a night. And a major crisis in our community for a long time has been opioid use. Thank goodness that opioid numbers are decreasing significantly, but that doesn't mean it's not a problem. Many numb through taking medication to dull their senses. Rather than feel all this hurt and pain and darkness, I'd rather just not feel anything. At least I can control that. Unfortunate side effect of numbing is you can't just numb the darkness, you also numb the light. You can't just numb the pain and the hurt, you also numb the joy and the celebration. You cannot selectively numb. As one of my favorite people in the world, I think you know who, maybe some of you know who I'm referencing, Brené Brown, has said you cannot selectively numb. But these aren't the only ways that we numb through alcohol and drugs. Jesus asked that our hearts be not weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of this life. Drunkenness might be obvious, but this dissipation is also present, this overindulging. So let me ask you real quick. You don't need to answer out loud, but what's your stress food? I heard some murmuring going on back there. I saw a coffee cup go up in the air. Where do you go for retail therapy? Not anymore. You don't have to go anywhere. You just go here. What's up, Amazon? I got it in 2 days or even sometimes today. We can use food to avoid the broken and hard and dark places of our lives. But not just food. Sometimes we maybe leave the TV on all day to not hear our own thoughts. Maybe it's binging Netflix. Maybe it's leaving cable news on all night long. Maybe more accurate, it's Netflix on the TV while we doom scroll on our phones. Because one screen's not enough. So we need to have multiple screens, one with whatever shows on there, and then I'm on Instagram Reels just doom scrolling all the things. Or maybe it's shopping. There's a reason it's called retail therapy. Buying things is a way for us to feel like we're in control, or a way that we can have some order and get a little dopamine hit in our brains. Man, things are really hard right now. But maybe if I bought that thing I don't need, I'll feel better for a moment. We numb. Or we try to mask the darkness with a little bit of dopamine, with that bag of Doritos. The problem is, for our emotional darkness, there's no localized anesthesia. As I just mentioned, there's only general anesthesia. If we try to numb the dark thoughts or emotions, we necessarily numb joy and peace. That's the byproduct. Church, are you afraid of the dark? How do you cope with the darkness you are experiencing, whatever it may be? Do you numb? Well, if we're being honest, we probably do. And Jesus knew this. It's what he said. This dissipation, this numbing, is a form of despair. It looks at the situation around you and it says, well, this sucks. I guess I'll grab a bag of Doritos and binge some Netflix for a couple hours. This dissipation says I'm helpless to change my circumstance, so I might as well give in and give up. What's the point? It's a form of nihilism. It's despair. And when we numb, or as Jesus said, when we dissipate despair, Jesus says that we weigh our hearts down. Be on guard so that your hearts are not weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of this life, and that day does not catch you unexpectedly like a trap. We may think that our despairing or our numbing or our distracting is harmless, but according to Jesus, it can spring on us when we least expect it. Dissipation and drunkenness and being caught up in the worries of this life are forms of despair. What then is the alternative? When faced with defeating situations, how do we respond? When faced with death and destruction and brokenness and calamity and chaos, how are we to respond? If not despair, if not throwing our hands up in the air and saying, what's the point, then what? What do we do? Well, despair is simply another word for hopelessness. Despair is simply and succinctly hopelessness. Hope, church, hope is not afraid of the dark. In fact, hope exists in the dark. Hope is birthed in the dark. Despair is one response to the darkness of our lives. Despair is one option when we're faced with brokenness, confusion, and chaos. But there's another option. That's what we read in Jeremiah 33 just a few moments ago as the nation was divided. So Jesus says when all of these calamities take place, lift up your heads. There's another option, and that option is hope. And when you look at hope, hope is not birthed when everything is going perfectly. That's not when you hope. You don't hope for something when you already have it, right? You might hope for something new. You might hope for a different situation. You might hope to become someone else, someone other than who you'd been in those dark days, but you don't hope for something when you've already got it. That's not hope. If you already possess the thing for which you hope, it's not hope. You're just enjoying the thing that you have. This is what Paul says in Romans chapter 8. For in hope we were saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope. What he's saying here is hope that is realized, that is actualized, hope that is already here, that's not hope. For who hopes for what is seen? This is Paul again. Who hopes for what is seen? Who hopes for what is already actualized, for what is already realized? If we hope for what we do not see, if we hope for what has not come to fruition, we wait for it with patience. You don't wait for what you already have and what you already are. Hope, then, as an option to the darkness, is necessarily future-oriented. No one hopes for the past. That's called nostalgia. It's not hope. Now, you might wish that your past was different than it was, but that isn't hope. Hope is always forward-looking. Hope is always anticipatory. Hope is about the future. Hope is about the things that are yet to be. And believe it or not, grief and lament are forms of hope. I want to take just a moment to distinguish between despair and lament. Despair is one option of one response to the darkness of our lives. Despair says, this is hopeless. There's no point. What's the meaning in any of this anyway? It's meaninglessness. It's nihilism. It's nothingness. Lament, however, is not despair. Lament is longing for things to not be as broken as they are, to not experience the pain and the loss and the suffering of your current situation and circumstance. Lament is longing for things to change. Lament is saying, how long, O Lord? How long, O Lord? When is this going to change? It doesn't dismiss the brokenness or the darkness of the world around you. It is a yearning for more, for better. How long, O Lord? And lament, unlike despair, is actually a form of hope. Lament is a way to hope. It is not despair where you think all is lost. It is grief, acknowledging that darkness and brokenness, and an acknowledgement that things are not as they ought to be. So when we lament, it is deeply connected with hope. Are you afraid of the dark? How is it that even in the dark we can hope? How is it, church, that even in those dark moments of our lives we cannot lose ourselves in dissipation and despair as we are so wont to do? Well, when God faced the dark, and God did face the dark, and God does face the dark, God did not numb. God did not dissipate. God did not despair. No, the good news for us today is that when God experiences the darkness of this world, God does not turn on Netflix and pull up his phone or head to the mall or pull up Amazon or grab a beer. No, when God faces the darkness, he runs headlong into it. He doesn't avoid it. He doesn't distract from it. God becomes it. He who knew no sin became sin so that we might become his righteousness. When he was faced with sin and darkness, he did not run away from it. He entered into it and became it so that he can redeem it. Church, the good news is not that there will be no darkness. The good news is not that there will be no poor or broken or afflicted. The good news is not that there will be no darkness. I'm sorry if that's the good news you want to hear. That's not the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The good news is not that there is no pain and there is no suffering. No, the good news is that God arrives in that darkness. The good news is that God shows up in the dark and makes a way where we think there is no way. God arrives in cosmic darkness at creation. But that also means God shows up. God arrives in emotional darkness. God arrives in political darkness. There were less amens with that one, I just need to say. God arrives in economical darkness. Doesn't mean he makes everything better. This isn't prosperity gospel, okay? This doesn't mean he magically gives you $5,000, but he's there with you. God arrives in ecological darkness. One of my great hopes as we are experiencing a potential climate, we don't have a potential climate crisis, as we are on the verge of climate catastrophe, that God will show up in ecological darkness. Now here's the thing, church. God arrives in marital darkness. God arrives in parent-child darkness. God arrives in relational darkness. God arrives in the dark. And that's good news. And that means that we too can face the dark. We don't need to despair. We don't need to dissipate because God is with us in those dark moments. We don't need to dissipate because God is present with you in whatever darkness you are facing right now. And I know if we got 90 people in the service this morning, that there are probably 150 different dark situations y'all are facing. We don't have to dissipate when we know that God is with us in those dark moments we are facing. And this is what we celebrate at Advent. The arrival of Christ, Emmanuel, God with us. If that's not good news, I don't know what is. Now listen. Emmanuel does not mean God fixes all my problems. It's not that God makes my life better or peachy or everything goes my way and I get every green light on the way to work. Emmanuel is God with us. As Marisol said earlier this morning, in those moments where you give everything up and you put all your trust in him to take you where you need to go, embracing that newness of life. God is with us in our present darkness. In these moments, God is Emmanuel. And because of that, we don't need to despair, but we can hope. Hope for his future. Because God is with us, and because God's future is better than any future that we could ever ask or imagine, we do not need to be weighed down with darkness. But we can, with Christ, make it through that darkness with the hope that comes from only him. And church, this is the good news of Jesus Christ for us today.